Fetching data in Next.js sounds so simple, right? I mean, just create an async function, grab some data with Prisma or whatever, call it inside your component, and boom, you're done. Except you're really not. Because what you actually did was just create an internal post request. Also, you just blocked all parallelism, which means things could have loaded faster, but they won't. And worse, you probably just bypassed your auth layer. You see, it's not that your code doesn't work. It works, but it doesn't scale and it's not secure. But don't worry, in this free video I am going to show you how to fetch data in Next.js the right way. With a proper data access layer, smart use of the React cache function, and with secure patterns, which actually makes sense. So let's dive right into it. So to get started, I created a simple to-do application in which a user can create a to-do, and then this to-do is rendered down below. Let's create a demo to-do together. So for the title, I will say subscribe now, and for the content, I will pass some gibberish. If I click on submit, we get this pending state, and then the new to-do is rendered down below. Let's quickly analyze the code base. So this is my page.tsx, and here's the important thing. This page.tsx is marked with the use client directive, which means essentially this is a client component. Let's also scroll a bit to the bottom. So as you see, I already set up client-side validation with React hook form. Then here we have my export default function. And then in my return statement, I have a card, then this form component, and then all of my inputs. This form calls an onSubmit function. And then in this onSubmit function, I call the create to-do server action. This create to-do server action is stored in my actions file. So as you see right here, I get the data, I do a bit of server-side validation, and if everything is fine, if all of the data is correct, then I create a new to-do with Prisma, and then at the end I also revalidate my path, which means I just pretty much revalidate all of the cache, I purge it. And here's the important thing, this file is marked with the use server directive. This means every function which is exported from this file will be automatically converted into server action. Please keep that in mind. But this video isn't about mutations. This video is about fetching data. So how do I fetch these to-dos? How do I get this data? Well, let's again open our page.tsx, and as you remember, this page is marked with the use client directive. This means I probably fetch data on the client side, right? Yes, correct. Right here I have this use effect hook, and in the use effect hook I fetch data, and to be specific, I call a get to-dos function to get my data. But where is this function stored? Well, if I open my actions file, right here I have a get to-dos function. I get my data using Prisma, and then I return it. This is a huge problem. But why is this a problem? I mean, it works, right? Because if I go back and do a hard refresh, I get my data. Well, yes, here's the thing. It works, but this does not mean that you should use server actions to fetch data. This actually creates a post request. Let me show it to you. So I can open my inspector, then we can go to the network tab, and if I do a hard refresh, we will get all of our network requests right here. But I want to get a specific one, and it should be called localhost. Let's see, will I find it? Yes, right here, localhost. This is a fetch request. If I open it, request method post. But wait, I just fetch data. When you fetch data, you don't want to create a post request. No, you want to create a get request. And this post request creates two problems. First of all, it breaks caching. You can't really cache post requests. And secondly, there's no parallelism. Parallelism? What do I mean by that? Well, right here, we create our to-do. When we create a to-do, we create a mutation, a post request. When we fetch data, we also create a post request. And these, I guess, requests run successively. So here's the thing. Let's go back to our server action. Right here, I have my get to-dos function, and I will create a fake delay, 15 seconds. If I go back and do a hard refresh, I have to now wait 15 seconds until I get my data. So let's create a mutation while our data loads. So I will open my inspector. I will go to the network tab. As you see right here, localhost is pending for 15 seconds. If I now create a title and some content and click on submit, I'm waiting and waiting and waiting. This request should already be finished. I mean, it does not take 10 seconds to create a post request, especially since my network is not throttled. And as you see, it still isn't created. I'm still waiting. Only after 15 seconds, my submission was successful. So this is what I mean. Our data fetching, our requests run successively. So here's a little diagram. As you see, we have to wait for the first request to finish. It has to succeed until our second request can actually even start, not finish, but start. So we wait for the first request, then for the second request, then for the third request. As you see, this is not performant. Ideally, what we would want to have is that our data gets fetched right here. This is request number 1, but our mutation should also start instantly. And our mutation won't take 15 seconds. It will take like literally 0.01 seconds. So they should start in parallel. And that's exactly why we want to create a GET request instead of a POST request. So how can we fix this problem? How can we fetch data in Next.js using a GET request? Well, we want to use server components. So as you all know, Next.js is built on top of two key principles: server components and client components. Server components let you fetch data and render parts of your UI on the server. You can optionally also cache the result and stream it to the client, whereas client components allow you to create interactivity or use, for example, browser APIs. So what we want to do is fetch data in a React server component, for example, also cache it, and more importantly, we want to also stream our response or the response. So let's go back. This page.tsx is currently marked as a client component. Let's delete the use client directive, and since we still need interactivity, I will instead create a separate component. So in the components folder, in the web folder, I will just create a to-do form.tsx file and I will mark it with the use client directive. Inside of here, I will create an export function to-do form, and then in this function, I want to return my form itself. So here I have my form. I can just copy it and then paste it inside of here. Let's again go back, and then instead of rendering the form, I will render the to-do form component, which I just created. So this is now a server component, the page.tsx, and this to-do form is the client component. As you see, I still get quite a few errors, and these are import errors. So let me just copy all of these import paths, and then everything will be fixed. So I have now moved everything into the to-do form component, everything which is related to the form itself. This means client-side validation, the onSubmit function, and stuff like that. But now we have one problem. In the page.tsx, I don't fetch any data anymore. As you see right here, my to-dos are complaining because I don't get any data. And as mentioned, we want to fetch data in a React server component. All pages, all components in Next.js as a default are server components. This means I can just copy this async function getToDos from my server action. I can delete it from the actions file, and instead I will paste it right here into my page.tsx. I want to import Prisma from the lib folder, and then in this export default function home, I will just call my to-dos, so this getToDos function. I want to mark the function as async, and if I go back and do a hard refresh, we have to now wait 15 seconds until I get my data. So let's again comment out this await new promise, this demo delay, and if I again do a hard refresh, I will get my data instantly, as you see right here. If I open my inspector again and open the console or the network tab and do a hard refresh, you won't see this localhost request anymore because now everything is fetched on the server side. But if I again add my fake delay of 15 seconds and do a hard refresh, I have to wait 15 seconds until I get my data. This is not very nice, not good user experience. Therefore, I want to implement a suspense boundary, which means I want to stream the response. So underneath this export default function, I want to create a new function, and it's important that you mark it as asynchronous. So right here, I have a new asynchronous function, to-do list, and in this function, I call my getToDos function to get the data. Then inside of here, I map over my to-dos and then render them. So this means instead of now mapping over my data in the export default function, I can instead just render the to-do list component. So I will just delete this div and just render this to-do list. Then in our export default function, we can delete this await getToDos, and I can also delete the async modifier because we don't await any data anymore. And if I again go back and do a hard refresh, you now see nothing happens. Everything is still the same. But as mentioned, I want to suspend my data loading loading. This means I can wrap this to-do list in a suspense boundary, and then I can also pass a fallback which says loading ... If I save this and again go back and do a hard refresh, you now see I instantly get my form, but we suspend our data loading, which means we display loading ... And let's see if also our requests now run in parallel, because this is super important as mentioned. So I will again do a hard refresh. I will pass some gibberish for the title and content, and if I click on submit, you see it was successful instantly, and we still display this loading state, and that's because our requests now run in parallel. They start at the same time, not successively anymore, and that's super important. So we finally fixed issue number 1, which was a simple one but quite a costly one if we wouldn't have updated our code. So how do we currently fetch our data? Well, we fetch it on the server side in a React server component. This is correct. But where do we create our async function? Well, we create it in the page.tsx itself. But this is actually a huge mistake. I mean, let's imagine the following. This should be a private route. What I mean by that is only authorized or authenticated users should be able to view this route and create a to-do. How would you verify the session? Well, you would probably go into this export default function, then fetch the user session and create an if statement. But this creates a huge mistake. So let's do the following. Let's implement auth. Once we implement auth, we will verify the session, and once we do that, you will realize that the current way of fetching data is incorrect. So in this video, we will use Kind to implement auth. Kind is the sponsor of this video and my favorite auth solution. They offer both authentication and also advanced authorization, and soon they will offer billing, which will make it super easy to start monetizing your ideas, which is super cool, and I also already got private beta access. But without any further ado, let's sign in and let's create a new business. Once signed in, you want to create a business with a business name, kind domain, number of employees, and region. As you see, my business has been created, so I can open it. Then we have a little onboarding guide, so I want to use Kind with my existing code base. Then I want to use Next.js, and I want to allow my users to sign in with email, Google, and then also GitHub. Then I can click on Next, and we are almost finished. And the next step is to connect our Next.js code base with Kind. So I can click on connect, and here we have a little quick start guide. So I will quickly implement Kind myself, and once finished, I will come back. So I now set up Kind. I installed the dependency, I added all of the environment variables, I added the API endpoint, and the next step is to allow our users to sign in, or in other words, register. And for that, we can use the login link and register link components. So I will copy the import statement. Then I want to open the navbar component, and inside of here, you will see that I currently render 2 buttons, a login button and a register button. But these are simple dummy buttons. And currently I have this dummy state constant is logged in, which is set to true. So let's first of all import the register link and login link components. And then for the login button, I want to render the login link component. And for the register button, I want to render the register link component. These are headless components, so I will also add a class name, which will be equal to button variants. If I save this and again go back, you will see right here 2 buttons, a login button and a register button. I want you first of all register, and as you see, I got redirected back to the Kind authentication page, and I can now register either with Google, GitHub, or using my email. I will continue with Google, and as you see, I got redirected back to my application. Nevertheless, I still render a login and register button, but if I go to my inspector, open the application itself, and then go to my cookies, you will see that I have an access token. This means our authentication process was successful. So let's fetch our user session in the navbar. So I can delete the constant is logged in, and I will create a constant. I can destruct, and this will be equal to get kind server session. The get kind server session exposes functions which run exclusively on the server side. I want to get the get user function, and since this is a promise, I want to also await this function, meaning constant user equals to await get user. So now I get my user session, which means I can use my user for the ternary. So if we have a valid user session, I will will render this logout button. If we don't have a valid user session, I will render a login and register button. Also, instead of rendering a standard logout button, I will render the logout link component, and also I will add a class name which will be button variants. So we have now implemented authentication, and I want to now continue with the next step. And the next step is to verify the session on the route itself, or on the route level. Therefore, let's go back to our page.tsx, and here we have our export default function home. And I want to pretty much verify the session for the whole page. This means we want to fetch the session in this export default function home. So we can mark this function as asynchronous. Then I can copy this getKindServer session hook from my navbar, paste it right here in the export default function home. Let's import getKindServer session. We now get our user, and let's create an if statement. If we don't get a valid user session, then I want to redirect the user to /API/auth/login. And let's test it out. If I go back and do a hard refresh, everything works. But if I copy the URL and open it in a new incognito tab, then you will see that I will get redirected to the kind hosted authentication page. So where is the mistake? I mean, we now verify the session, and if the user does not have a valid session, we just redirect the user to log in. Well, here's the thing. What's the fundamental idea of React? Reusability, as you all know. But what is if we reuse our component? Right here we have this async function getToDos, and then we have this to-do list component. But let's imagine the following. Since we use React and we want to reuse our components, we create a separate function. So in the components folder, I will just create a, to-do list.tsx file, and then I will just copy this async function to-do list. I will paste it inside of here. Of course, let's also export it, and then I will also copy this async function getToDos. I will also paste it into this to-do list component, and this is also a server component, which means everything still runs on the server side. And if I go back to my page.tsx, I can just import this to-do list from my components. If I save this and again go back and do a hard refresh, everything still works. Because again, if I copy the URL and open it in a new incognito tab, I will get redirected to the hosted authentication page. But again, what am I talking about? I mean, everything works. We check that the user has a valid session, and we fetch our data on the server side, and we suspend our data loading. I mean, we fetch our data the right way. No, not quite. Currently, we fetch our data in the to-do list component, and we verify the session in the export default function home. This means this code runs at first, and after that, we only call this to-do list component, which means only then we fetch our data. But what is if a user, some member of your team, goes into your app directory, creates a new route, the test route, and then in the test route, this user, your coworker, just renders your test or to-do list component, which is imported from the components. Nothing will break, and then if this member coworker will open the test route, everything will work. We get our data, everything is rendered nice, and I mean, the data is validated, right? Or we check that the user has a valid session, correct? No, we don't, because if I now open this test route in a new incognito tab, you will see that I see this data, this super private data, which only authorized users should see. So what's exactly the problem? Well, currently we only verify the session in the page itself, but not when we fetch our data. And this is a huge mistake. You don't want to verify your session in the page itself, because when you then break a component, or when you break your code into separate components and then fetch the data in the separate component, you don't verify the session anymore. I see so many people verify their sessions in the page itself, and then they break the data fetching into a separate component, and then this breaks everything. So what's the solution? You might say, okay, Jan, so instead of then fetching, or instead of verifying our session in the index page, how about we just go into our async function and get our user session right here? Yes, this is already a super good solution, but we don't want to actually define this async function in the to-do list component itself. We want to create a data access layer. So if you go to the Next.js documentation and search for data access layer, you will find this section. And right here they say, we recommend creating a data access layer to centralize your data requests and authorization logic. The data access layer should include a function that verifies the user session session as they interact with your application. So what exactly do they mean? Well, they want you to create a separate file, a separate folder, whatever, which centralizes your data access logic. In this data access file or in the function itself, you want to then verify the user session and then fetch the data itself. Let's quickly implement it and then I will talk about the key benefits. So currently we have this getToDo's function and we want to create a data access layer. This means in our app folder, we can create a data folder, and then in the data folder, I want to create a to-do folder. And in the to-do folder, I want to create a get-todos file. And inside of here, we want to now fetch our to-dos. So I can go back to my to-do list component. I can just copy this export async function, get-todos. Let's go back and let's paste it inside of here. I will for now delete this authorization check. We won't need it right now. So now we have this get-todos function, which means I can go back to my to-do list and then I can import or I can call this to-dos get-todos function, which I just created in this get-todos file. So this is our separate data access layer. And this means if I go back and do a hard refresh, everything still works. But what's the benefit of this data access layer? I mean, nothing changed, right? Well, the benefit is quite simple. In this data folder, which is again our data access layer, we can now create a user folder. And in the user folder, I want to create a require-user.ts file. Let's again create an export async function. This will be require user. And then inside of here, I want to get my user session. So we can again use the get kind server session hook. I want to get the user. And if we don't have a valid user session, I will redirect the user to log in. And then I can use this require user function in my actual get-todos function. So above my constant to-dos, I will call await require user. And with that, I now validate the user session right in my actual data access function. So where I fetch my data. This means if I go back and copy this URL, localhost 3000/test, and open it in a new incognito tab, you will see that I won't see this data. I will get redirected back to the hosted authentication page. So instead of verifying our user session in the page itself on a page level, we now validate our user session right there where we get our data, which means our data will only be returned if we have a session. But what's the benefit of a data access layer? Good question. First of all, since we consolidate all of our data related code in a single place, we also have a single source of truth. This means if I need to update something, I can just go into my data folder, find the specific file which I need, and then I can update my code. Everything is centralized in one place. This makes it easier to update and debug our code. And secondly, as mentioned again, a data access layer creates a very natural checkpoint because we can now always call this require user function, and with that we can verify the user's identity before we even fetch data. Because if this is false, if there's no valid user session, we won't even fetch this data, which means there's not even a chance to leak any sensitive data. And this is a huge benefit. So now we are finished with our data access layer. And again, what you should do is store all of your data access logic in this data folder. If you want to query to-dos, then create a to-do folder in the data folder and create all of your functions in the to-do folder. Get to-dos, get to-do, get, admin to-dos, whatever. If you have some sort of user specific logic, then create a user folder, require user, get all users, and stuff like that. And since we're finished with our data access layer itself, the, concept, I want you also optimize these functions a bit. So first of all, this function should only run on the server side, and it should also only be called from the server side. So for example, right now, my to-do form component is the server component, not the to-do form, I'm sorry, but the to-do list. This is a server component, which means the code, this get-to-dos function, also only runs on the server side. But let's imagine the following. Let's open this test route. In theory, this is a client component. I marked it as a client component. I could go inside of here and just say, hey, constant data equals to await get-to-dos. And then if I save this and go back and do a hard refresh, I just get this weird error. This method must be invoked in a Node.js environment. I want to have something which says, hey, you are in a client component. This function has to run on the server side. So there's an easy solution to implement something like that, and that's import server only. So JavaScript modules can be shared between both server and client component modules. This means it's possible to accidentally import server-only code in the client. For example, consider the following function. This is a function which should only run on the server side. So this function contains an API key and this should never be exposed to the client. To prevent usage in client components, you can use the server-only package. Now, if you try to import the module into a client component, there will be a build time error, not a runtime error. So let's import server-only. Let's go back to our getToDo's function, and then on the top, I can just say, hey, import server-only. And also server only is installed as a default when you create a brand new Next.js project. And if I now go back and do a hard refresh, we get a new error, a better error. And it says you are importing a component that needs server only, that only works in a server component, but one of its parents is marked with use client. So it's a client component. So as you see, we now get a nice error and also a build time error. There's no way of leaking anything to the client because this import server only is like its own function which runs at the start. It first of all checks, hey, is this the server or are we in a server environment? If not, then let's just throw a new error. If everything is fine, then this function will just run as it normally does. Let's also copy this import statement and let's paste it into our require user function. And now both of our functions are completely safe and they will only run on the server side. And also you might ask me, hey Jan, what's the difference between import server only and then in our actions file use server? When you mark a file as use server or with the use server directive, all of the functions which are exported from this file will be automatically converted into server actions. This import server only does not modify anything. It just checks that the code is actually executed on the server side. That's it. There's no server actions, nothing like that. This only runs on the server side, while this use server creates server actions which can be called both from the server and client side. So we now made a key security optimization, but there's still a performance optimization that we have to make. So here's the thing, right here we have this require user function. This require user function is called in all of my data access functions. So in my getToDo's function, in a getToDo function, in a getAdminToDo's function, stuff like that. Now let's imagine the following. You create a dashboard, and then for the dashboard you want to create multiple data, or you need multiple data entries. You want to get your subscribers, you want to get your total customers, you want to get the total revenue for the last 30 days and stuff like that. So in this case, let's just, for example, take our test route, and then in the test route, you will now call, for example, 10 functions. So again, get customers, get subscribers, get money, get whatever. 10 functions will be called. In every function, you will call this require user function because you want to check that the user has a valid session. This also means you will call this require user function 10 times. But I mean, after the first time, we will already know if the user has a valid session. I mean, we don't have to call this function 10 times to verify that. And this is also a very key performance problem because it will take a lot of time, and this is pretty much not needed code or not needed data fetching. So what is if we could fetch the require user function one time, get the session, and then cache the result for this one render? So if you go back to the Next.js documentation and search for this creating a data access layer section, you will see this code example. This is the verify user function where they verify if a user has a valid session, and they wrap it, or they pretty much define this function in a cache function. So this verify user function is very similar to our require user function. We check that the user has a valid session, and then using this cache function, we can cache the result. And this cache is only scoped to a single server-side render pass. It does not persist. This means if we go to our dashboard route, for example, it will cache the result of this require user function for one render pass as it renders this one page, and then after you make a subsequent render, it won't cache it. It will again do a normal fetch. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense to use this cache function in a verify, or in other words, in this require user function. So I will rewrite this code a bit, and I will create an arrow function, and we will define this arrow function in the cache function. So again, how does this work? Well, if you have multiple functions that you call in one route, so in the dashboard route, you will call 10 functions. Every function calls this require user user function. For the first time, we will first of all call this require user function and we will get a result. For example, valid user session. For each subsequent request in this one render pass, we will cache the result. But if the user then navigates from the dashboard route to the home page, we will then again call the require user function without any cache. So this cache only caches the result for one render pass. So now we have import server only. This means a security optimization, and we use this cache function specifically in the require user function, which means we also optimized for performance. But now let's continue with the next mistake, the next problem. So in our navbar, we currently fetch our user session. I use the getKindServer session hook to expose the getUser function. The getUser function fetches the user session on the server side. That's all fine, it works. So if I go back and do a hard refresh, you see I have a valid session, and this means I render this logout button. But here's the thing. For example, if I open my test route, in my test route, I don't fetch any data inside of here anymore. It's only a standard export default function, and I return test route. This means in theory, this should be a static route. Well, that's at least in theory, because if I go into my terminal and run pnpm run build, you will see that this will create an optimized production build, and you will also see something very interesting. So right here it created our optimized production build, and our not found route is dynamic. Our index page is dynamic. Our test route is dynamic. Huh? What's the problem? Again, in our test route, we don't fetch any data. This not found route should also be static. I mean, I don't fetch any data in the not found route. What's the problem? Well, where is our navbar rendered? Well, our navbar is rendered in our layout. So if I open my layout file, my root layout, you will see right here, I render my navbar inside of here, above the children. And again, in the navbar, I get the user session on the server side. So what's the problem? Well, here's the thing. Whenever you fetch data in a layout on the server side, all of the children automatically will be converted to dynamic rendering. This means there's no static rendering anymore. Everything will be dynamically rendered. And that's a huge problem. You don't want that. I mean, we want to have a fast application, and this means we want to also have static routes. So how can we fix this big problem? Well, solution number one would be to not fetch any data in layouts. So this means I would have to delete this code from the navbar, and then everything would again be rendered statically, or in other words, the test route would be rendered statically. But I want to get my user session, so I have to fetch data in a layout. So what's solution number two? Well, solution number two is to fetch data in a layout, but on the client side. So instead of using the getKindServer session hook, I will use the useKind browser client. I will mark the navbar component as useClient, or with the useClient directive. I will delete the getKindServer session import statement, and then I will delete the async modifier, and then constant user will be equal to get user. This means if I again open my terminal and run pnpm run build, our test route in theory should be rendered statically. And yes, as you see, our index page is rendered dynamically. That's fine. We fetch data in our index page, and our test route is now rendered statically, as they say right here, pre-rendered as static content. So again, here's the thing that you should remember. Whenever you want to get data in a layout, never fetch the data on the server side. Always fetch it on the client side, because if you fetch it on the client side, you will preserve static rendering. If you fetch it on the server side, all of the children will be automatically converted into dynamic rendering, and you don't want that. So yeah, we are now finished with this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. It would mean so much to me and my heart. So please do it. And now I hope I can see you in the next video. By the way, I'm working on a long form video, which will come out in a few days. And now enjoy your day and bye.